My mom said. Be the bigger person. You owe your brother this much, after giving my apartment to him while I was away. Minutes later, I showed up with the police. I had just spent 2 grueling weeks on a commercial construction site in Texas, dealing with delayed supply chains, incompetent subcontractors, and a heat wave that felt like it was trying to melt the steel beams into puddles. All I wanted was a hot shower, a heavy pour of bourbon, and the absolute silence of my own home. I dragged my duffel bag down the dim industrial hallway of my building, the familiar scent of old brick and roasted coffee from the cafe downstairs, acting like a signal to my brain that I was finally off the clock. I stopped in front of my door, heavy steel, painted matte black, my pride and joy. I reached out and tapped the glass surface of the smart lock keypad, the numbers illuminated in a crisp white glow. I punched in my 6-digit code. The lock blinked red. A soft, automated voice chimed. Access denied. I paused, blinking away the travel fatigue. Maybe I hit the wrong key. My fingers were stiff from the flight. I took a breath, rolled my shoulders, and entered the code again, slower this time, making sure each press registered. Red light access denied. Master code overridden. The words did not process immediately. Master code overridden. As a civil engineer and a general contractor, I do not believe in ghosts in the machine. Systems do what they are programmed to do. If the master code was overridden, a physical human being with backup access had manually bypassed the digital security protocols. I stood in the quiet hallway staring at the digital panel. I did not pound on the door. I did not shout. My hands did not shake. Instead, a cold, heavy clarity settled into the pit of my stomach. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out my phone, and dialed my mother. She picked up on the second ring, her voice bright, breezy, and entirely too cheerful for a Thursday evening. Vance, honey, she chirped. I am so glad you called. I was meaning to reach out to you earlier this week, but things have just been completely out of control around here. I kept my voice perfectly level. Mum, why is the master code on my apartment door overwritten? There was a slight pause on the other end of the line, the kind of pause people make when they are bracing for an impact they know is coming but still hope to dodge. Well, she started, her tone shifting into that placating butter would not melt in her mouth register she always used when she was trying to smooth over a disaster. That is actually what I wanted to talk to you about. We had to move Ethan in. I stared at the black steel door. Ethan. My 25-year-old brother. What are you talking about? I asked, the words clipping off sharp and hard. Oh, Vance. Try to have a little compassion. She sighed instantly, playing the guilt card. You know the divorce is finalized. Sophia kicked him out of the house. He has absolutely nowhere to go. He is devastated. Honey, his whole life is falling apart. Your father and I could not just let him sleep in his car or at some cheap motel. So, you let him into my home? I asked while I was out of state. You are single, Vance, she reasoned, her voice gaining confidence now that the secret was out. You are 28. You make good money. You can easily stay at a nice hotel for a while or rent another place. Ethan needs stability right now. He needs the comfort of a nice home to get his head straight. You owe your brother this much. Just take the hit for the family, okay? Be the bigger person. She kept talking, rambling about family unity and forgiveness. But I had stopped listening. The sheer audacity of it echoed in the hallway. They did not ask. They simply took. I did not hang up immediately. I just let her talk, listening to the sound of her justifying a literal home invasion. Finally, when she paused to take a breath, I spoke. "I will handle it," I said quietly. "Oh, thank you, Vance. I knew you would understand. You are always the reliable one. We will have you over for dinner on Sunday to celebrate." I ended the call. The silence of the hallway crashed back down around me. I dropped my heavy duffel bag onto the concrete floor. I unzipped the front compartment and pulled out my rugged contractor laptop. I sat down cross-legged, right there on the hallway floor, flipped the screen open, and booted it up. I am a contractor, but I specialize in modern infrastructure. When I built this loft, I did not just wire it for electricity. I wired it for absolute control. The smart home system was enterprise-grade, the kind of setup you usually see in high-end commercial properties. I opened the admin portal. It took me less than 30 seconds to access the security logs. I read the data streaming across the screen. 4 days ago, at 2:00 in the afternoon, someone used the physical emergency backup key, the one I had left in a sealed envelope in my father's safe for absolute life or death emergencies, to open the door. 10 minutes later, the system registered a manual hard reset on the control panel. They had wiped my thumbprint and my hex code, replacing it with a new one. They thought they had locked me out. They did not realize that a physical override does not sever the cloud administration rights if you know the backdoor protocols. I did not get up and bang on the door. I did not scream my brother's name. I let my fingers fly across the keyboard. First, I accessed the network router. I permanently blocked every MAC address currently connected to the Wi-Fi. Goodbye, high-speed internet. Second, I accessed the climate control. It was a crisp 45 degrees outside. I overrode the thermostat, shutting down the heating matrix completely. Third, I accessed the smart breaker panel. I killed the power to the entertainment center, the kitchen appliances, the hot water heater, and every single power outlet in the living space. The only thing I left active was a single harsh overhead light in the bathroom. I locked the permissions. No one inside that apartment could change the settings without my digital authorization. I closed the laptop, slid it back into my bag, and stood up. I adjusted my jacket, picked up my luggage, and turned my back on my own door. I walked out of the building and stepped into the cold evening air. The police precinct was exactly 6 blocks away. I did not run. I walked at a steady, measured pace. The anger inside me was not hot or explosive. It was freezing cold. It was the kind of anger that builds structures, calculates load-bearing walls, and prepares to tear them down with absolute precision. The precinct smelled like stale coffee, floor wax, and tired people. I walked up to the front desk. A desk sergeant looked up from his monitor, eyeing my dust-covered boots and heavy jacket. "Can I help you?" he asked. I set my bag on the counter, unzipped the side pocket, and pulled out a thick manila folder. I always travel with hard copies of my most vital documents. It is a habit you learn quickly in the construction business. I need to report a breaking and entering and an illegal occupation of my property, I said, my voice steady. The officer sighed, reaching for a notepad. "Domestic or stranger?" "My brother," I replied. He used a stolen emergency key to access my home, changed the electronic locks, and has taken up residence. I have the property deed, the utility bills in my name, my state identification, and the digital security logs proving the unauthorized entry. I slid the folder across the counter. I want him removed, now. To understand how my family reached the point where stealing a home seemed like a reasonable course of action, you have to understand the dynamic of the house I grew up in. I am 3 years older than Ethan, but from the moment he could walk, the universe was meant to revolve around him. In psychology, there is a term for it, the golden child. Ethan was charismatic, loud, and constantly demanded attention. I was quiet, observant, and liked taking things apart to see how they worked. My parents made their preferences clear, not through grand declarations, but through 1,000 tiny daily choices. If Ethan broke a window playing baseball, it was an accident. Boys will be boys. If I left a tool on the workbench, I was lectured about responsibility and respect for property. I started mowing lawns at 14 to buy my own clothes. Ethan got a brand new sports car for his high school graduation because my parents did not want him feeling inferior to his friends. The rule of the house was unspoken but absolute. Vance handles his own problems. The family handles Ethan's problems. Ethan's greatest achievement in life was marrying Sophia. Sophia was smart, beautiful, and came from a family with serious generational wealth. Her father owned a chain of luxury car dealerships. When they got married, my parents acted like Ethan had won the Nobel Peace Prize. They bragged to everyone who would listen about their son's massive house in the suburbs and the country club memberships. But Ethan had never learned how to actually build anything, let alone a marriage. He thought a wealthy wife was just another parent, someone meant to provide for him while he did whatever he pleased. He spent her money, refused to hold down a steady job, and eventually started sleeping around. Sophia did not tolerate it. She was not our mother. 3 weeks ago, she packed his expensive clothes into garbage bags, left them on the driveway, changed the locks on her house, and handed him divorce papers. When Ethan fell, he fell hard and true to form. My parents scrambled to catch him. They threw themselves into a frenzy, trying to cushion the blow for their perfect boy. But they lived in a small 2-bedroom retirement condo. They did not have the space or the luxury Ethan was accustomed to. And then they looked at me, the reliable one, the one who never asked for anything, the one who had just finished building something beautiful. They saw my life, my stability, and decided it was the perfect sacrifice to lay at Ethan's feet. They honestly believed that because we shared the same blood. My achievements were simply communal assets waiting to be redistributed whenever the golden child stubbed his toe. They did not understand what that apartment meant to me. They thought it was just a place to sleep. They had no idea about the blood, the sweat, and the sheer force of will it took to bring it to life. 2 years ago, I found the space. It was a derelict storage loft above a failing printing press. The roof leaked, the wiring was a fire hazard waiting to happen, and the floor was covered in decades of grime. Nobody wanted it, but as a civil engineer, I did not see the garbage. I saw the bones. I saw the exposed brick hidden under cheap drywall. I saw the massive steel I-beams. I signed a 10-year ironclad lease with the building owner, with a clause that allowed me to gut and renovate the space in exchange for locked-in rent. For 6 months, I worked 2 jobs, my day job managing commercial construction sites, and my night job rebuilding my own home. I tore down the rotted walls with a sledgehammer until my hands bled through my gloves. I rented a heavy-duty grinder and spent 3 weekends on my hands and knees, grinding the old concrete floor down to the aggregate before pouring and leveling a flawless epoxy resin finish. I rewired the entire electrical grid myself, pulling miles of copper through old conduits. I designed and built a custom kitchen, pouring a massive solid concrete countertop that required 4 men to lift into place. I installed smart glass in the bathroom, automated blackout shades, and a security system that could rival a bank. It was not just an apartment. It was my resume. It was the physical manifestation of my competence, my sanctuary built exactly to my specifications. I remembered the only time Ethan ever came to visit. It was a month after I had moved in. He walked through the heavy steel door, wearing designer loafers he had bought with his wife's credit card. He looked around the industrial space, wrinkled his nose at the exposed ductwork, and sneered. "You actually live here?" he had asked, laughing. "It looks like a sweatshop. Sophia and I have a guest house bigger than this. Why do you always have to be so blue-collar, Vance?" He had mocked it. He had looked at the culmination of my hardest work and called it garbage. And now, because he had ruined his own life, he thought he could just slide into the home he had insulted, change the locks, and claim it as his own, standing in the police station, watching the desk sergeant review my paperwork. Something inside me finally snapped, not with a loud noise, but with the quiet, permanent click of a lock tumbling into place. The final threat of obligation I felt toward my parents severed entirely. The good son who always kept the peace, who always stepped aside, was dead. In his place was a contractor who had just found unauthorized personnel on his job site, and I was about to clear the site. The police do not usually like getting involved in property disputes, preferring to pass them off as civil matters. But my documentation was flawless. I had the lease, the utility bills, the construction permits in my name, and the digital logs proving exactly when the lock was tampered with. There was no ambiguity. It was a textbook case of breaking and entering, followed by a legal eviction. 30 minutes later, I was walking back down the familiar brick hallway, flanked by 2 uniformed officers. The heavy tread of our boots echoed loudly. Officer Miller, a broad-shouldered veteran with a no-nonsense demeanor, stepped up to my black steel door and knocked loudly. "Police, open up." There was a long silence followed by the sound of fumbling from the other side. The door swung open. There stood my brother, Ethan. The visual alone was enough to make my jaw clench. He was wearing my dark gray, heavy cotton bathrobe in his right hand. He held one of my crystal tumbler glasses filled with amber liquid that I instantly recognized as my expensive 18-year-old Macallan Scotch. He looked confused, then irritated, and finally panic flashed in his eyes when he saw me standing behind the officers. "What is going on here?" Ethan asked, his voice cracking slightly. "Sir, are you the legal resident of this apartment?" Officer Miller asked, his hand resting casually on his duty belt. Ethan immediately shifted into the role he had played his entire life, the victim. He puffed out his chest and put on a look of wounded innocence. "Yes, I mean, it is a family home. My brother let me stay here because I am going through a really terrible divorce. I am just trying to get back on my feet, and he is having some sort of mental breakdown. He actually tried to Darvo the cops, deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender. It was almost impressive how naturally the lie rolled off his tongue." I did not raise my voice. I stepped forward holding my manila folder. "Officer, I have never given this man permission to enter my home. I have been out of state for 2 weeks. He used a stolen backup key to access the premises and altered the electronic locks to deny me entry. I have already provided you with the digital logs and the lease agreement." Ethan's face flushed deep red. "Vance, what the hell are you doing? Mom said it was fine. You cannot just throw me out on the street." "We are blood." "Sir," Officer Miller interrupted, his tone instantly hardening. "The lease is solely in Master Vance's name. You have no legal standing here. Changing the locks on a property you do not own constitutes an illegal eviction. You have exactly 10 minutes to gather whatever personal belongings you brought with you and vacate the premises, or you will be leaving in handcuffs for trespassing and breaking and entering. But I live here now." Ethan whined, the sophisticated facade crumbling into that of a petulant child. "Mom gave me the key. She said it was mine until I got on my feet." "Then you can take that up with your mother," the second officer said, stepping into the doorway and gesturing inside. 10 minutes. "Let's move." Ethan looked at me, pure hatred radiating from his eyes. He slammed the crystal glass down on the concrete counter, my concrete counter, spilling the expensive scotch, and stormed past the officers into the bedroom to pack. I stood in the doorway and watched him. I did not feel a shred of pity. I surveyed my living room. The place I had left spotless was a disaster. There were takeout boxes on the coffee table. My carefully arranged bookshelves had been pushed aside to make room for his massive gaming monitor. Ethan emerged exactly 9 minutes later, dragging 2 large designer suitcases. He was out of breath and glaring daggers. "You are a monster. Vance," he spat, stopping right in front of me. "Mum and Dad are never going to forgive you for this. You are dead to this family." I looked at him completely unbothered. "Drop the robe. Ethan." He blinked. "What?" "That is my bathrobe," I said, my voice deadpan. "Take it off." He stared at me, humiliated, as the 2 police officers watched silently with shaking hands. He stripped off the heavy cotton robe, leaving him standing in the hallway in a wrinkled t-shirt and sweatpants. He threw the robe at my feet, grabbed his suitcases, and marched toward the elevator, muttering curses under his breath. The officers stayed long enough to ensure he left the building entirely. They handed me an incident report number and advised me to change the physical core of the lock immediately. I thanked them, locked the door behind them, and finally stood alone in my own home. But the victory was short-lived. I turned on the lights using my master override on my phone and really looked at the apartment. The engineer in me took over. It was time to assess the damage. I walked through the quiet space, my heavy boots making absolutely no sound on the rugs. The adrenaline that had been pumping through my veins during the confrontation was completely fading away now, replaced by the hyper-focused, incredibly cold and analytical state I always enter when I am assessing a compromised commercial job site. I did not feel like a victim whose sanctuary had been violated. I felt like a forensic auditor stepping into a disaster zone, ready to calculate the exact cost of someone else's catastrophic negligence. I went straight into my home office, opened my heavy fireproof wall safe, and pulled out my professional digital single-lens reflex camera. I took the time to attach a high-powered external flash. Then, I grabbed my thick leather-bound contractor logbook, a couple of heavy-duty graphite pencils, and a steel tape measure. It was time to go to work, and I was going to be meticulous about every single millimeter of this place. Ethan had only been inside my home for 4 days, just 96 hours, but a man who has never respected the value of hard labor, a man who has always had his messes cleaned up by a wealthy wife or enabling parents, can cause an astonishing, almost breathtaking amount of destruction in 96 hours. I started my assessment in the kitchen. My absolute pride and joy in this entire loft was the massive center island. I had poured it myself from a custom mix of high-strength glass fiber reinforced concrete. I had spent countless hours polishing it with diamond grip pads until it was smooth as glass, and then I had sealed it with a premium commercial-grade epoxy resin to make it invincible. I walked over to the exact spot where Ethan had slammed down my crystal glass just minutes prior. He had not just spilled expensive scotch, he had been slicing fresh lemons directly on the surface without using a cutting board. The citric acid from the lemons had eaten entirely through the protective epoxy sealant, leaving deep, cloudy, white etch marks right into the dark concrete matrix. You cannot just take a wet sponge and wipe that away. Fixing it meant bringing in heavy industrial wet grinders, stripping the entire 12-oot surface down to the base layer, repolishing the concrete all over again, and applying a brand new coat of resin over the entire island so it would cure evenly. The specialized labor alone would cost thousands of dollars. I snapped 4 high-resolution photos from different angles, making sure the flash highlighted the chemical burns perfectly. Next was the flooring in the main living room. When I renovated, I had installed 3/4 in thick, solid Brazilian walnut planks floating over a premium sound dampening subfloor. Brazilian walnut is incredibly dense. It takes a lot of deliberate force to damage it. I knelt down on the floor, running my bare hand over the wood. There were deep, jagged gouges running a continuous length of 14 feet straight across the center of the room. Ethan had dragged his heavy, oversized designer suitcases, which clearly had a broken metal wheel, straight across the bare wood instead of carrying them. The scratches were way too deep to simply buff out with some floor wax. Repairing this meant I would have to pull up the baseboards, rip out the damaged interlocking planks, install brand new ones, and then completely sand and retain the entire living room floor to ensure the color and finish matched perfectly without any visible seams. I laid my bright yellow steel tape measure right beside the massive gouges for scale and took a dozen macro shots, documenting the exact depth of the destruction. The master bathroom was somehow even worse. I had installed a high-tech smart glass shower enclosure, the kind that transitions from crystal clear to completely frosted opaque with the flick of a wall switch. But the system was malfunctioning. Ethan had somehow managed to crack the waterproof digital control panel mounted on the subway tile wall, likely by throwing something heavy at it during a temper tantrum. The liquid crystal privacy layer inside the thick glass panes was bleeding out, creating a massive, ugly, dark blotch right in the center of the door. The entire custom glass panel would have to be scrapped, custom ordered from the manufacturer, and replaced by a specialized technician. I moved systematically from room to room. I documented the ugly black burn marks on the outdoor balcony railing where he had been lazily putting out cigars. I photographed a noticeable dent in the brushed stainless steel refrigerator door. I noted the missing bottles of high-end liquor from my cabinet and the completely ruined wine-stained Egyptian cotton bedsheets that had to be thrown in the garbage. I stood in the middle of the absolute mess created by my own flesh and blood, looking at the camera screen. Before I tell you how I made him pay for every single penny of this disaster, let me know down in the comments. Has your family ever done something that crossed the line so badly you had to draw a permanent boundary? With every click of the camera shutter, the massive mental spreadsheet in my head updated itself. I was not pricing this out like a forgiving older brother willing to overlook a few scratches. I was pricing this out exactly like a licensed general contractor dealing with a rogue, destructive tenant. I factored in the current retail cost of premium replacement materials, the standard industry markup for expedited shipping, and the hourly rate of master tradesmen. More importantly, I factored in my own professional hourly rate as the project manager overseeing the necessary repairs. When I finally finished my sweep, I sat down at my kitchen table, opened my laptop, and created a new project file. I named it Ethan's Eviction. I uploaded the high-resolution images, attached the digital smart lock access logs, and began drafting a formal itemized contractor estimate. The total came to just over $25,000. I looked at that massive number glowing on the screen and felt nothing but cold, satisfying clarity. He was going to pay. By the time I woke up the next morning, my cell phone was an absolute war zone. I checked the screen and saw 47 missed calls and dozens upon dozens of text messages. My mother had left 3 incredibly long voicemails, and her tone shifted wildly in each one. The first was a bargaining, pleading tone, asking me to just calm down and talk to them. The second was full of furious weeping, accusing me of throwing my own brother out onto the freezing streets. The third was just pure rage. My father had sent a massive wall of text detailing how I was single-handedly tearing our loving family apart. He complained that Ethan was currently sleeping on their lumpy, uncomfortable living room sofa, that my mother had not stopped crying all night, and that he was profoundly disgusted by my lack of compassion and empathy. Even extended relatives, aunts, and cousins I had not spoken to in over 3 years were suddenly chiming in, blowing up my phone to call me a ruthless, heartless monster who cared more about a stupid apartment than human lives. I did not reply to a single one of them, not a word. I immediately employed the grey rock method. It is a psychological tactic where you become as totally unresponsive and uninteresting as a grey rock, starving, manipulative, and narcissistic people of the emotional drama they desperately crave to survive. I went straight into my phone settings, silenced all of their notifications, and routed every single one of their numbers directly to voicemail. The silence inside my apartment remained beautifully unbroken. At exactly 9:00 in the morning, I called my attorney, David. David was a sharp, aggressive, non-nonsense guy in his late 40s who specialized in commercial property disputes and high-stakes contract law. I had kept his firm on retainer for my construction business for years. I securely emailed him the entire digital file I had compiled the night before. The signed lease agreement, the smart lock security logs, the official police incident report number, the high-resolution photographs, and my $25,000 itemized contractor estimate. David called me back exactly 20 minutes later. His voice crackled clearly through my truck's Bluetooth speakers as I was driving to a job site. Vance, I just reviewed the file. This is absolutely bulletproof. The illegal eviction alone gives us grounds for heavy statutory penalties in this state. The extensive property damage is just the final nail in the coffin. Do you want me to send a formal demand letter to scare him, or do we go straight to filing a civil suit? Skip the warning letter, I told him. Merging onto the busy highway, file the suit immediately, push for maximum allowable damages, and David, under no circumstances do we offer or accept the settlement. I want a judge to rule on this. Understood completely. David replied smoothly. He is likely going to try and claim the damage was an unavoidable accident or just normal wear and tear from moving his things in. We can easily crush that argument with your photos, but honestly, it would be a lot easier and faster if we had solid proof of a behavioral pattern, something showing he does this on purpose. That specific phrase gave me an idea. During my lunch break, I sat in my truck and made a very specific phone call. 2 hours later, I was sitting in the shaded patio section of a high-end, overpriced coffee shop downtown. A massive black luxury sport utility vehicle pulled up to the curb, and Sophia, Ethan's wealthy ex-wife, stepped out. She looked absolutely immaculate, wearing a tailored designer blazer and oversized dark sunglasses, looking entirely unbothered and glowing with the energy of a woman who had just dropped 180 pounds of dead weight. She walked over, sat down across from me, ordered an iced espresso, and offered a polite, knowing smile. Vance, I have to admit, I was genuinely surprised to get your call this morning. I just assumed you were part of the great family blockade against me. I am not part of that family anymore, I said plainly, looking her in the eye. I quickly and calmly explained the entire situation to her. The break-in while I was out of state, the destroyed custom concrete, the gouged Brazilian walnut floors, the police escort, and the massive civil suit I had just authorized my lawyer to file. Sophia listened quietly, sipping her iced coffee when I finally finished detailing the $25,000 estimate. She set her glass down on the table and let out a dry, entirely humorless laugh. God, he is so incredibly predictable, she murmured, shaking her head. He throws a massive temper tantrum, breaks expensive things he did not pay for, and just expects someone else to swoop in and clean it up. He did the exact same thing to me. That is actually the final reason I threw him out of my house. She reached into her expensive leather handbag, pulled out a sleek silver flash drive, and slid it directly across the marble table toward me. I have a comprehensive enterprise-grade smart home security system too. Vance, inside and outside the estate. The afternoon I handed him the official divorce papers, he completely lost his mind. He took a metal golf club to my custom kitchen cabinets and threw a heavy crystal vase straight through a vintage stained glass window in the foyer. I had my security team pull all the footage in case I needed to file for an emergency restraining order. Everything is on that drive in high definition. I picked up the small metal device. It felt heavy with consequence. It was the exact missing puzzle piece David had asked for. It established a clear, undeniable, legally binding pattern of malicious destruction of property whenever Ethan was angry. "Why are you giving this evidence to me?" I asked, putting the drive in my pocket. Sophia gracefully adjusted her sunglasses. "Because for 3 long years, your parents made me feel like I was the crazy, demanding wife for simply expecting their perfect son to act like a grown man. I want him to finally face the harsh reality he has been dodging his entire life. Take him to the cleaners, Vance, ruin him." The civil court hearing was officially scheduled and took place exactly 6 weeks later. I arrived at the downtown courthouse early, wearing a dark, perfectly tailored suit, feeling completely calm. David met me in the echoing marble lobby, carrying a thick, heavy leather binder containing all of our printed exhibits and a secure laptop. We walked into the courtroom and confidently took our seats at the plaintiff's table. 10 minutes later, the heavy double doors at the back of the room creaked open, and my family walked in together. It was a truly pathetic sight to witness. Ethan was wearing a cheap grey suit that was clearly at least a full size too large for him. He had probably borrowed it from the back of my father's closet. He looked exhausted, pale, and intensely nervous, his eyes darting around the room. My mother flanked him tightly on the right side, looking frail and clutching a wadded-up tissue in her hands, clearly ready to deploy her strategic tears at a moment's notice. My father walked slightly behind them, keeping his head down and absolutely refusing to make any eye contact with me whatsoever. They quietly took their seats at the defense table across the aisle. The judge, a stern, sharp-eyed woman in her late 50s who looked like she had zero tolerance for nonsense, called the docket number and asked both sides for their opening statements. Ethan's defense attorney was a cheap, disorganized man whose suit looked just as wrinkled as his arguments. He stood up and immediately tried to frame the entire narrative as a tragic, simple family misunderstanding. He loudly claimed that my mother had given Ethan verbal authority to access the apartment, that Ethan genuinely believed he was an invited welcome guest, and that the extensive damages were purely accidental byproducts of a highly stressful, emotional moving process, right on cue. My mother sniffled loudly from the wooden benches in the gallery, dabbing her eyes aggressively to maximize the theatrical emotional effect for the judge. David stood up next. He did not raise his voice. He did not engage with their ridiculous emotional theatrics or family drama. He simply and methodically laid out the cold, hard data. First, he presented the legally binding lease agreement proving my absolute undisputed sole tenancy of the property. Then he fired up his laptop and projected the smart lock data logs directly onto the large courtroom monitor. He walked the judge step by step through the exact timestamp of the forced entry, using the emergency key and the subsequent manual override of the electronic security codes. "Your Honor," David said smoothly, his voice cutting through the quiet room. "An invited welcome guest does not manually wipe the electronic access codes of the primary resident to lock them out. This digital evidence demonstrates clear, undeniable premeditation to illegally occupy the premises against my client's will." The judge nodded slowly, her expression hardening as she took diligent notes. Then came the issue of the damages. David formally submitted my $25,000 itemized contractor estimate into evidence. Ethan's lawyer immediately jumped up and objected, wildly claiming the numbers were grossly inflated to punish his client. David calmly countered this by handing the judge a thick stack of 3 independent certified quotes from other licensed general contracting firms in the city. Their estimates were actually a few thousand higher than mine. My client is a fully licensed professional contractor. "Your Honor," David explained patiently, "the materials destroyed by the defendant were custom, incredibly high-end fixtures. We are solely seeking the exact replacement value of the materials and the standard prevailing hourly labor rates required to restore the property to its original condition." Finally, David clicked a button on his laptop. The defense claims the massive damage to the property was a simple accident. We submit this video evidence legally obtained from the defendant's former spouse, establishing a highly documented, undeniable pattern of malicious property destruction when the defendant is operating under emotional distress. The security video played on the large screen in crisp high definition. The entire courtroom watched in absolute stunned silence as the footage captured Ethan screaming at the top of his lungs, taking a metal golf club and repeatedly smashing a beautiful custom kitchen cabinet door to splinters before picking up a heavy crystal vase and hurling it straight through a vintage stained glass window. Ethan's face drained of absolutely all color. He sank down low in his wooden chair, staring blankly at the defense table. My mother instantly stopped her fake crying and stared at the projection screen in open mouth, genuine horror. My father buried his face deeply in his hands. The lifelong, carefully crafted illusion of the innocent golden child was being broadcast in high definition for the official legal record. The judge did not even need to call a recess to deliberate in her chambers. She looked over her reading glasses down at Ethan with an expression of absolute, unvarnished disgust. "The evidence presented here today is absolutely overwhelming," she stated firmly, her voice echoing with authority. This was not a family misunderstanding. This was an egregious, calculated violation of property rights and the intentional, malicious destruction of a private residence. I am ruling completely in favor of the plaintiff for the full requested amount of $25,000, plus all associated legal fees and court costs. She picked up her wooden gavel and struck the sound block. It sounded exactly like a gunshot. The execution was complete, and there was no appealing the truth. The wide marble hallway immediately outside the courtroom was quiet, save for the muffled, distant sounds of other legal proceedings taking place down the corridor. David shook my hand firmly, packed his laptop and files back into his leather briefcase, and headed toward the bank of elevators, congratulating me on a flawless victory. I stayed behind, standing completely alone near the tall arched windows, silently, watching the busy city traffic moving through the streets below. A moment later, the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung open violently, and my family walked out into the hall. The crushing reality of a $25,000 legal judgment had finally physically hit them. Ethan had absolutely zero personal assets to his name. He had no savings account. He had no job. The judge's order was absolute. If he did not pay the sum in full, his wages would be severely garnished indefinitely the very moment he ever managed to find employment, and his personal credit score would be permanently destroyed for the rest of his adult life. My parents knew exactly what this meant. They knew perfectly well that saving their precious, perfect boy from total financial ruin and bankruptcy was going to require them to drastically liquidate a significant portion of their own retirement accounts. My mother separated from the group and marched purposefully toward me, her heels clicking aggressively on the marble floor. Her eyes were still red from the courtroom, but there was absolutely no sadness or pleading in them anymore. There was only pure, unadulterated fury. My father and Ethan hung back near the heavy doors, staring at the floor, far too cowardly to walk up and face me directly. "Are you happy now?" she hissed venomously, stopping just a few feet away from me. Her hands balled into tight fists. "You just completely ruined your own brother's life. You practically stole from your own parents. We are going to have to dip deeply into our retirement savings to pay for this ridiculous, vindictive judgment. You destroyed this entire family over a stupid apartment." I looked down at her, studying her face. I realized in that exact moment that I did not feel angry anymore. I did not feel betrayed. I just felt a profound, echoing sense of emptiness, like I was looking at a complete stranger whose personal problems were absolutely none of my concern. "I did not destroy anything," I replied, my voice remaining dangerously calm and completely level. "Ethan broke the law. You actively enabled him and cheered him on. The judge simply held him accountable for his own actions. That is exactly how the real world operates outside of your living room. He is your younger brother," she cried out, her voice echoing shrilly in the long marble hallway. "Family is supposed to love each other unconditionally. Family forgives mistakes. Family is supposed to love and treat each other better than strangers," I corrected her coldly, not breaking eye contact. "If a random, nameless stranger broke into my home, changed my electronic locks, and intentionally caused tens of thousands of dollars in property damage, I would have pushed the district attorney for maximum criminal charges. I would have made sure he was put in a jail cell. I let Ethan walk away today with a simple civil penalty. Taking his money instead of taking his freedom was my absolute final act of mercy to this so-called family. Do not ever attempt to contact me again." I turned my back on her before she could even open her mouth to formulate a response. I walked away with steady strides toward the elevators. As I walked, I pulled my cell phone out of my pocket, went into my contacts, and permanently blocked her number, my father's number, and Ethan's number. The polished metal elevator doors opened with a soft chime. I stepped casually inside, pressed the glowing button for the main lobby, and watched my mother's deeply shocked, pale face disappear forever behind the closing metal doors. The heavy lock on my life had finally clicked shut, securing everything inside. 6 full months had passed since the sound of that gavel echoing in the courtroom. The slow transition from late autumn into early spring had finally breathed new, vibrant life into the city. The weather was perfect. I stood out on the private open-air rooftop terrace of my apartment building, using a pair of metal tongs to flip a thick, perfectly marbled ribeye steak on my massive stainless steel grill. The evening air smelled incredibly good, a mixture of rich wood smoke, charred meat, and the faint, cool, salty breeze blowing in constantly from the city harbor, directly behind me. The heavy sliding glass doors leading into my loft were pushed wide open to let the fresh air circulate inside. The apartment was absolutely pristine. In fact, it was significantly better than pristine. The massive sum of $25,000 had cleared my business bank account exactly 30 days after the judge issued the court ruling. I knew for a fact that my parents had been forced to drain a massive chunk of their retirement funds to pay the penalty on Ethan's behalf. But I honestly did not lose a single second of sleep over it. I took that money and used the funds exactly as they were intended. I hired a highly specialized, expensive crew to come in and polish my custom concrete kitchen island back to a flawless mirror-like finish. The ruined Brazilian walnut floors were entirely ripped out and replaced, meticulously sanded and perfectly sealed, gleaming richly in the warm afternoon sunlight. I also took the opportunity to make a few serious security upgrades. The standard smart lock on the heavy steel front door was now entirely gone, replaced by a commercial enterprise-grade biometric fingerprint scanner, wired with military-grade encryption software. The master code could absolutely never be bypassed with a physical emergency key ever again. My personal fortress was now absolute and impenetrable. "Those steaks are looking really good, man," James said, stepping out onto the terrace and pulling me out of my thoughts. He handed me a cold, sweating bottle of imported beer. James was my oldest, most reliable friend, a guy I had known since our college days, who now worked alongside me as a structural engineer. "Give them exactly 5 more minutes to rest," I told him, taking a long, refreshing sip of the cold beer, looking back inside the brightly lit loft. 3 of my best colleagues from the commercial construction firm were sitting around my large dining table, laughing loudly at a joke someone had just told. The music was playing at a low, comfortable, ambient volume. It was a relatively small gathering, just a few solid guys who actually understood the true value of hard work, respect, and loyalty. "You ever hear anything from them?" James asked quietly, leaning his elbows against the brick parapet and looking out thoughtfully at the glowing city skyline. He did not need to specify who the word "them" meant. "No," I said simply, keeping my eyes focused firmly on the hot grill. "And I never will. The boundary is permanently set in stone." I had occasionally heard minor updates through the grapevine, mostly gossip from mutual acquaintances and distant relatives who still check my social media. Apparently, Ethan was still miserably sleeping on my parents' lumpy couch. He was currently bouncing rapidly between terrible minimum-wage jobs, constantly blaming the entire world, his ex-wife, and me for his massive failures. My parents were supposedly still complaining bitterly to anyone who would tolerate listening about their cruel, ungrateful, cold-hearted eldest son. But all of that noise just felt like a bad movie playing in a completely different room with the volume turned all the way down to 0. It did not touch me. It could not reach me anymore. I looked back inside my beautiful home. The fading golden afternoon sunlight hit the polished concrete counter, illuminating the tiny dust moles dancing happily in the air. This space was completely and utterly mine. I had bought it with my own intense labor, designed it with my own intellect, and violently defended it with cold, hard, undeniable facts. Sharing blood with someone does not entitle them to drain your sanity. Sharing DNA is absolutely not a blank check to freely destroy what you have painstakingly built. Some life lessons are incredibly expensive to teach, and some bridges absolutely need to be burned to the ground so that the fire can light your way forward in the dark. I pulled the perfectly cooked steaks off the hot grill, setting them carefully on a thick wooden cutting board to rest. I breathed in the cool evening air deeply, feeling a profound, unshakable sense of true peace. I was a builder. I had found the deep rot spreading in the foundation, and I had surgically removed it. Now there was absolutely nothing left to do but peacefully enjoy the strong, beautiful house I had built.